4. Departures and Arrivals. The next morning, Mrs. Dashwood, with 2 of her daughters, went to visit Lady Middleton. Marianne wished to remain at home, and her mother, thinking that no doubt Willoughby had promised to call on her while she was alone, was quite happy to agree. When they returned from the park, they found, as expected, Willoughby's carriage waiting outside the cottage. But what they did not expect, as they entered the house, was to see Marianne rush out of the sitting-room, sobbing uncontrollably, and run upstairs. Surprised and worried, they went into the room, where they found only Willoughby. His face showed signs of the same strong feelings that had moved Marianne. "Is Marianne ill?" cried Mrs. Dashwood. "I hope not," he replied, trying to look cheerful. "Indeed, it is I who may expect to be ill, as I am now suffering under a very heavy disappointment. I am unable to visit you any longer. My cousin, Mrs. Smith, has this morning decided to send me to London on business. As a poor, dependent relation, I must do what she asks. I have already left Allenham, and now I have come to say good-bye to you." "This is very unfortunate. But Mrs. Smith's business will not keep you from us for very long, I hope." He reddened as he replied, "You are very kind, but I have no hope of returning to Devonshire immediately. My visits to Mrs. Smith are never repeated within the year." "And is Mrs. Smith your only friend? Is Allenham the only house where you are welcome? My dear Willoughby, surely you do not need to wait for an invitation to Barton Cottage." His colour deepened, and with his eyes fixed on the ground, he only replied, "You are too good." Mrs. Dashwood looked at Eleanor with surprise, and Eleanor felt just as astonished. After a moment's silence, Willoughby added confusedly, "At present my time is not my own. I cannot hope—" He stopped. Then, smiling weakly, he said, "It is foolish to go on in this manner. I will not punish myself any longer by remaining among friends whose society it is impossible for me now to enjoy." Hurriedly he said good-bye, and left the house. His carriage was soon out of sight. Mrs. Dashwood's concern and alarm at his sudden departure were too great for her to express. Eleanor also felt extremely disturbed by Willoughby's changed behaviour. One moment she feared that he had never had any serious intention of marrying Marianne, and the next that some unfortunate argument had taken place between him and her sister. But her strongest feeling was one of pity for Marianne, who must now be in the depths of the most violent sorrow, and her romantic nature would consider it a duty to feed and encourage her misery. Soon Mrs. Dashwood felt able to discuss the situation with her eldest daughter. She was now more cheerful, and had persuaded herself that Willoughby was only leaving Devonshire on the orders of his rich relation, because Mrs. Smith suspected and disapproved of his engagement to Marianne. "His dearest wish," she went on, "will be to return to Barton as soon as he can." Eleanor, listening patiently, agreed that this was quite possible. "But if they are engaged," she said, "although it may be necessary to hide the truth from Mrs. Smith, there is no reason to hide it from us." "My dear child," cried her mother, "it is strange for you to accuse Willoughby and Marianne of hiding their feelings when you have accused them of showing their feelings too openly." "I want no proof of their affection," said Eleanor, "but of their engagement I do. I am perfectly happy with both. Has not his behaviour to Marianne, for at least the last fortnight, shown that he loved her and considered her his future wife? Is it possible, Eleanor, to doubt their engagement? Willoughby must be aware of your sister's love for him. How could he leave her, perhaps for months, without telling her of his affection? I confess, said Eleanor, that everything points towards their engagement. Except for one thing. Their silence on the subject. And for me, that is the greatest difficulty of all. Oh, Eleanor, I do not understand you. You prefer to believe in bad rather than good. Do you suspect Willoughby? But is he not a man of honour and feeling? You cannot really think he is deceiving Marianne. I hope not. I believe not, cried Eleanor. I sincerely love Willoughby, and I find it painful to suspect his intentions. Perhaps indeed you are right, and there is a simple explanation for his strange behaviour this morning. They saw nothing of Marianne until dinner, when she took her place at the table without saying a word. Her eyes were red and her face pale. She avoided looking at anyone and could neither eat nor speak. She continued in the depths of misery all evening. Any mention of anything to do with Willoughby made her burst into tears instantly, and although her family were most anxious for her comfort, it was impossible for them to keep clear of every subject which her feelings connected with him. Marianne would have thought herself very insensitive if she had been able to sleep at all the first night after parting from Willoughby. She would have been ashamed to look her family in the face if she had not risen from her bed more in need of rest than when she lay down on it. But there was no danger of this happening. She spent most of the night sobbing bitterly, and got up with a headache. She passed the rest of the day, and several more days after that, in feeding her sorrow, by playing all Willoughby's favourite songs, by reading the books they used to read together, and by walking alone on the hills where they used to walk, until her heart was so heavy that no further sadness could be added. No letter from Willoughby came, and none seemed expected by Marianne. Her mother was surprised, and Eleanor again began to worry. One morning, about a week later, Eleanor persuaded Marianne to join her sisters in a walk. As they went along the road away from the cottage, they saw a gentleman riding towards them, and at once Marianne cried out in delight, "It is he! I know it is!" She ran eagerly to meet him, but Eleanor called out, "Marianne, I think you are wrong. It is not Willoughby." But Marianne would not listen, and continued running until she was quite near the rider, when she stopped suddenly. She had realized it was not Willoughby, and her disappointment was almost too great to bear. Just then the gentleman called to her, and she recognized Edward Ferrars. He was the only person in the world who could at that moment be forgiven for not being Willoughby, and she smiled at him, holding back her tears. After the greetings, however, she watched with growing surprise his polite and distant behaviour to Eleanor, which was very unlike a lover's. And when she heard that he had already been in Devonshire for a fortnight, without coming to see Eleanor, she almost began to feel dislike for him. "Have you been to Sussex recently?" asked Eleanor. "I was at Norland about a month ago," replied Edward. "How does dear, dear Norland look?" cried Marianne. "Dear, dear Norland," said Eleanor, "probably looks much the same as it usually does at this time of year, the woods and walks thickly covered with dead leaves." "Oh," cried Marianne, "those falling leaves gave me such delight. How I used to love seeing them driven around me by the wind. Now there is no one to watch them, no one to care." "It is not everyone," said Eleanor, "who has your passion for dead leaves." They all returned to the cottage together, where Edward received the kindest possible welcome from Mrs. Dashwood. Under her warm influence, he began to lose his shyness, or coldness, and to become more like himself. But he still did not seem cheerful. This was noticed by the whole family. "Well, Edward," said Mrs. Dashwood after dinner, "what are your mother's plans for you at present? Does Mrs. Ferrars still want you to be a politician?" "No. I hope my mother realizes I can never do that. I am afraid she and I will never agree in our choice of a profession for me. As you know, I did not enjoy studying law. I have always preferred the church, but that is too ordinary for my family." "So how are you to become famous? Because that is what all your family wants, I understand." "I shall not attempt it. I have no wish to be grand or important, and I have every reason to hope I never shall be." "I know you are not ambitious, Edward." "No. I wish, like everybody else, to be perfectly happy, but in my own way. Greatness will not make me happy." "How right you are!" cried Marianne. "What has wealth or greatness to do with happiness?" "Greatness has very little," said Eleanor, "but wealth has much to do with it." "Eleanor!" cried Marianne, shocked. "Money can only give happiness where there is nothing else to give it. Beyond answering our basic needs, money is of no use to us at all." "Perhaps," said Eleanor, smiling, "we may agree in the end. Your basic needs and my wealth are very much alike, I expect. Come, what is your basic figure?" 2,000 a year, not more than that." Eleanor laughed. 2,000 a year! 1 is my wealth. I guessed what you would say. And yet 2,000 a year is not a large income. A family cannot live on less. The right number of servants, a carriage, and horses for riding cannot be paid for with less than that. Eleanor smiled again, to hear her sister describing so accurately her future life with Willoughby. During Edward's visit, Eleanor was careful to behave to him with her usual politeness and interest. But in her heart, she was alarmed by his coldness towards her. It was clear that he was unhappy, and she doubted very much whether he still loved her. She could see, however, that his feelings were confused. Sometimes, for a moment, he looked at her as he used to, and this gave her hope again. The next day, as Marianne was passing some tea to Edward, she noticed a ring on his finger and mentioned it. "I never saw you wear a ring before, Edward," she cried. "Is that your sister's hair in the ring? But surely hers is darker." Edward blushed deeply, and looking quickly at Eleanor said, "Yes, it is Fanny's hair. It looks lighter than it really is." Eleanor had met his eye and knew the truth. She felt sure that the hair was her own, but it must have been taken from her without her knowing. She was not in the mood, however, to disapprove of this action, and changed the subject quickly. The Dashwoods were sorry to hear that Edward had to leave them after only a week. Although he expressed his great pleasure at seeing such old friends, and could give no good reason for his departure, there seemed to be something forcing him to leave. Eleanor blamed his mother for his rather odd behaviour. His lack of cheerfulness could easily be explained by his lack of independence. She wondered when, if ever, his mother would finally drop all her ambitions for him and allow him to make his own choices in life. A more comforting thought was the memory of his pleasant looks and words to her during his visit, and above all, the proof of his affection that he wore round his finger. In spite of the painfulness of Edward's departure, Eleanor was determined to hide her feelings and show a brave face to the world. Doing this did not lessen her sadness, but at least prevented her family from worrying about her. Marianne could not admire such behaviour, so unlike her own. She believed that self-control was easy for calm natures like Eleanor's, and simply impossible for passionate ones like hers. One morning, soon after Edward had left, Sir John and Lady Middleton and Mrs. Jennings came to visit the Dashwoods, bringing with them Mr. and Mrs. Palmer. Charlotte Palmer was Mrs. Jennings' younger daughter, but was completely unlike her sister, Lady Middleton, in every way. She was short and rather fat, and had a very pretty face, and smiled or laughed all the time. Her husband was a serious-looking young man, who made no effort to please or be pleased. He read the newspaper for most of the visit, only lifting his head from time to time to give a cross, unsmiling answer to his wife's foolish questions. She, however, took an immediate liking to Eleanor and Marianne, and spent much time in conversation with Eleanor in particular. When Eleanor realised that their home was in Somerset, near Willoughby's, she hoped to hear more about his character, so she asked Mrs. Palmer if they knew him. "Oh, yes, I know him extremely well," replied Mrs. Palmer. "Not that I ever spoke to him, indeed, but I have often seen him in town. Everybody likes and admires him. I know very well why you ask. I am delighted that your sister is to marry him." "You know much more of the matter than I do," said Eleanor, surprised, "if you have any reason to expect that." "Don't pretend it's not true, because you know it's what everybody in London is talking of." "My dear Mrs. Palmer, on my honour, they all talk of it. I met Colonel Brandon on Bond Street, and he told me of it immediately." "You surprise me very much. I would not expect Colonel Brandon to give such information, even if it were true." "Well, when I met him, I said, 'Colonel, I hear there is a new family at Barton Cottage, and Mamma says the girls are very pretty, and that one of them is engaged to Mr. Willoughby. Is it true?" And he said nothing, but from his expression I knew it was certain. Of course, I have known Colonel Brandon a long time. I believe, she added in a low voice, he would have been very glad to marry me if he could. But Mamma did not think him a good enough husband for me. In any case, I am much happier as I am. Mr. Palmer is just the kind of man I like. Chapter 5. Lucy Steele's Secret. The Palmers returned to Somerset the next day, but it was not long before Sir John had more visitors at Barton Park. On a morning's excursion to Exeter, he and his mother-in-law had met two young ladies, the Miss Steeles, whom Mrs. Jennings discovered to be distant cousins. Sir John, always eager for society, immediately invited them to stay at the park as soon as they were available, and most fortunately, they were able to accept the invitation almost at once. The young ladies arrived. Their appearance was by no means unfashionable, their dress was elegant, and their manners were very polite. They were delighted with the house and furniture, and they happened to be so madly fond of children that Lady Middleton had an excellent opinion of them by the time they had been at the park for an hour. Sir John hurried off to Barton Cottage to tell the Miss Dashwoods. "They are the sweetest girls in the world," he said. Eleanor smiled at this. She knew that, For Sir John, the sweetest girls in the world were in every part of England, with every possible kind of face, figure, and character. Sir John wanted the whole family to walk to the park immediately and look at his guests. Kind, thoughtful man. It was painful to him even to keep a third cousin to himself. But, in spite of his efforts, he could only gain the Dashwoods' promise to visit the park in a day or two. When the promised visit took place, they found nothing to admire in the appearance of the elder Miss Steele, who was nearly 30, with a very plain face. However, the younger, Miss Lucy Steele, who was not more than 23, had a considerable beauty. Her face was pretty, she had a sharp, quick eye, and she held herself with a certain air. Elinor soon noticed the pleasing manners and constant attentions with which they were winning Lady Middleton's approval. They were full of praise for the beauty and intelligence of her children, and full of admiration for Lady Middleton herself. Fortunately for those who use these clever tricks, a fond mother can never hear enough praise of her children, and therefore will swallow anything. Lady Middleton watched proudly as her spoilt children pulled the Miss Steeles' hair, stole their sewing scissors, and tore their books. She felt no doubt that the Miss Steeles were enjoying this quite as much as her children. She was only surprised that Elinor and Marianne should sit so calmly, without taking any part in the enjoyment. "How playful dear little William is," she said lovingly, as her second boy violently pulled Miss Steele's finger. "And here is my sweet Anna Maria, such a quiet little thing." She bent to kiss her daughter, but unfortunately a pin in her dress scratched the child's neck. Violent screams rang out, and the Miss Steeles rushed to help the suffering child. The little girl realized that the louder she screamed, the more attention she would receive, and nothing could be done to calm her. Finally, her mother was forced to carry her upstairs in search of her nurse, and the 4 young ladies were left in a quietness which the room had not known for many hours. "Poor little creature," said the elder Miss Steele. "I do not think there was any real cause for alarm," said Marianne firmly. "What a sweet woman Lady Middleton is," said Lucy Steele. Marianne was silent, as it was impossible for her to say what she did not feel. It was Elinor who was forced to reply. "She is a very fond mother," she said truthfully. "And the children," cried Lucy. "I love to see children full of life and fun. I cannot bear them quiet." "I confess," replied Elinor, "that while I am at Barton Park, I never think of quiet children with any displeasure." A short silence was broken by the elder Miss Steele, who suddenly changed the subject by saying, "How do you like Devonshire, Miss Dashwood? I suppose you are very sorry to leave Sussex. Norland is a beautiful place, is it not?" "We have heard Sir John admire it," said Lucy quickly. Elinor was surprised that the Miss Steeles seemed to know so much about her family. "Indeed, it is a lovely place." "And had you a great many handsome young bachelors there?" asked Anne Steele. "I'm afraid you may find it dull here. I do like a place with a lot of good-looking young men, but they must dress well and behave politely. I suppose your brother was quite an elegant young man before he married?" "Well," replied Elinor, "if he was before he married, he still is, because he has not changed at all." "Oh dear, I never think of married men being handsome young men. They have other things to do." "Good heavens, Anne," cried her sister, "you can talk of nothing but young men. You will make Miss Dashwood believe you think of nothing else." And she turned to another subject. This one meeting with the Miss Steeles would have been quite enough for Elinor, who disliked the vulgar freedom and foolishness of the elder, and the clever pretences of the younger. She left the park without wishing to know them better. The Miss Steeles, however, thought differently, and so did the sociable Sir John. Soon the young ladies of both houses were sitting or walking together for an hour or two almost every day. Anxious that they should get to know each other well, Sir John had helpfully informed the Miss Steeles of all the details of the Dashwoods' lives, and soon Anne Steele congratulated Eleanor on her sister's fortunate engagement to a very fine young man. "What a good thing to be married so young," she added. "I hear he is extremely handsome. I hope you may have such good luck yourself. But perhaps you have someone already." The Miss Steeles also heard from Sir John, with many smiles and jokes, about Eleanor's suspected attachment to a young man who had recently visited Devonshire. "His name is Ferrers," whispered Sir John, so that everyone could hear, "but it's a great secret." "Ferrers?" repeated the elder Miss Steele. "Mr. Ferrers? Your sister-in-law's brother, Miss Dashwood? A very pleasant young man. We know him very well." "How can you say that, Anne?" cried Lucy, who nearly always corrected everything her sister said. "We have only seen him once or twice at my uncle's." Eleanor was astonished. Who was this uncle? Where did he live? And how did they come to know Edward? She wished very much to have the subject continued, but nothing more was said about it, and she preferred not to ask questions herself. In the next few days, Lucy missed no opportunity of engaging Eleanor in conversation. She was naturally clever and often amusing, and as a companion for half an hour Eleanor found her quite pleasant. However, she knew nothing of books, music, or painting, in spite of her constant efforts to appear well-informed. Eleanor pitied her for her lack of education, but disliked her insincerity, her dishonesty, and the narrow self-interest that lay behind all her words and actions. One day, as they were walking alone together, Lucy said, "You will think my question strange, no doubt, but do you personally know your sister-in-law's mother, Mrs. Ferrers?" Eleanor did think the question strange. "I have never seen her," she answered a little distantly. "Then you cannot tell me what sort of woman she is?" "No," replied Eleanor, cautious of giving her real opinion of Edward's mother. "I know nothing of her." Lucy looked fixedly at Eleanor. "I wish I could tell you. I hope you will believe I'm not just being curious or impolite." She hesitated. "I do want your good opinion, and I'm sure I would not have the smallest fear of trusting you. Indeed, I would be very glad of your advice. I am in such an uncomfortable situation. I am sorry you do not happen to know Mrs. Ferrers." "I am also sorry," said Eleanor in great astonishment, "if it could be of any use to you to know my opinion of her. But I never understood you were at all connected with that family." "I do not wonder at your surprise. Mrs. Ferrers is nothing to me at present, but the time may come when we may be very closely connected." She looked shyly down as she said this, with only a quick look sideways at Eleanor. "Good heavens!" cried Eleanor. "What do you mean? Connected with Mr. Robert Ferrers?" And she did not feel much delighted with the idea of such a sister-in-law. "No," replied Lucy, "not with Mr. Robert Ferrers. I never saw him in my life, but," fixing her eyes on Eleanor, "with his elder brother, Edward." Eleanor looked at Lucy in silent astonishment. "You must be surprised," continued Lucy, "because, of course, he never mentioned it to any of your family. It is a great secret, and none of my relations know of it except Anne. I would never have told you if I had not trusted you completely. And I really thought I ought to explain my behaviour in asking about Mrs. Ferrers. I know Mr. Ferrers will not be displeased when he hears I have told you, because he has the highest opinion in the world of all your family, and looks on you and the other Miss Dashwoods quite as his own sisters." Eleanor forced herself to speak calmly. "May I ask how long you've been engaged?" "We've been engaged for 4 years now." 4 years. Eleanor still felt unable to believe it. "My sister and I often stayed at my uncle's house near Plymouth, here in Devonshire. Edward came to study law there for 4 years, and so we met and became engaged. I was very unwilling to enter into it, as you may imagine, without his mother's approval. But I was too young and loved him too well to be as cautious as I ought to have been. Dear Edward! Look, I carry his picture everywhere with me." She took from her pocket a small painting and showed it to Eleanor. Eleanor's last doubts of the truth of Lucy's story disappeared as she recognized Edward's face. "You can't think how I'm suffering," continued Lucy. "Everything is so uncertain, and we see each other so infrequently. I wonder my heart is not broken." Here she put a hand to her eyes, but Eleanor did not feel sympathetic. "Sometimes," Lucy added, "I think it would be better for both of us if I broke off the engagement completely." She looked sharply at her companion. "But then I cannot bear the thought of making him miserable. And to me, too, he is so very dear. What would you advise me to do, Miss Dashwood?" "I am afraid I cannot advise you in such a situation. You must decide for yourself." "Poor Edward! His mother must provide for him one day, but he is so depressed about his future. Did you not think him unhappy when he arrived at Barton recently?" "Yes," said Eleanor, aware of yet another fact in support of Lucy's story. "He had been staying with us at my uncle's. It made him so miserable, not being able to stay more than a fortnight and seeing me so upset. He still feels just the same. I heard from him before I left Exeter." Taking a letter from her pocket, she waved the envelope in Eleanor's direction. Eleanor recognized Edward's writing and finally had to accept that they must be engaged. Her heart sank within her. "Poor Edward does not even have a picture of me," Lucy went on, "although I have his. But I gave him a lock of my hair in a ring recently, and that was some comfort to him, he said. Perhaps you noticed the ring on his finger?" "I did," said Eleanor. Her voice was calm, but her calmness hid an unhappiness greater than she had ever felt before. She was shocked, confused, and miserable. Here their conversation ended, and Eleanor was left alone to think. She felt sure that Edward's affection was still hers. He certainly loved her, and had never intentionally deceived her. Unfortunately, he was now tied by an early and foolish engagement to a pretty but insincere, vulgar, and selfish girl, whose main interest lay in his future income. Eleanor's tears flowed more for Edward than herself. She had lost her chance of happiness with him, but would only be miserable for a time, while he had nothing at all to look forward to in life. Over the next few days, Eleanor took great care to hide her unhappiness. She was glad to spare her family the shocking news of Edward's secret engagement, as she knew that their affection and sorrow would only add to her misery. At convenient moments, she returned to the subject in quiet conversation with Lucy. She learnt that Lucy was determined to hold Edward to the engagement, and that Lucy was jealous of her because Edward apparently always spoke of her with great admiration. Indeed, what other reason could Lucy have for telling Eleanor her secret, if not to warn her to keep away from Edward? Eleanor realized with great sadness that Edward was not only without affection for his future wife, but that he had not even the chance of being reasonably happy in marriage. Chapter 6. Eleanor and Marianne in London. Mrs. Jennings now began to make plans to return to her house in London, and quite unexpectedly invited the elder Miss Dashwoods to stay with her there. "I've set my heart on it," she said in her comfortable way. "We shall have a very pleasant time together, I know, and if you do not like to go visiting with me, you can always go with one of my daughters. I have had such good luck finding husbands for my girls that I am sure your mother will think me a suitable person to look after you. If I don't get at least one of you married, it won't be my fault." Eleanor was unwilling to accept, as she knew that her mother would miss her and Marianne very much. She was also aware that Edward and the Miss Steeles would be in London at that time, and wished to avoid meeting them. But Marianne's eagerness to see Willoughby, who would most likely be in town by then, gave Mrs. Dashwood an excellent reason for insisting that they should accept Mrs. Jennings' generous invitation, and so it was agreed. During the 3-day journey, Eleanor had plenty of opportunity to compare Marianne's delightful expectations with her own acceptance of a cheerless future. It was clear from Marianne's bright eyes and happy smiles that she depended on finding Willoughby in London, and Eleanor determined to find out more about his character and intentions. On their arrival at Mrs. Jennings' handsome house, the young ladies were given Charlotte's old room, a large and comfortable apartment. Eleanor immediately sat down to write to her mother, and Marianne also sat down with pen and paper. "I am writing home, Marianne," said Eleanor. "Perhaps you should put off writing for a day or two." "I am not writing to Mamma," replied Marianne quickly. Eleanor realised Marianne must be writing to Willoughby, and thought with pleasure that the fact of their corresponding must mean they were engaged. The letters were finished and sent to the post. During the rest of the evening, Marianne appeared very agitated. She ate almost nothing, and seemed to be anxiously listening to the sound of every carriage. Suddenly, after dinner, there was a knock on the front door, and Marianne jumped up, moving eagerly towards the sitting-room door. She could not help crying, "Oh, Eleanor, it is Willoughby!" and seemed almost ready to throw herself into his arms when Colonel Brandon entered. It was too great a shock to bear with calmness, and she immediately left the room. Eleanor greeted the Colonel. She was particularly sorry that a man so in love with her sister should see that Marianne felt nothing but bitter disappointment in meeting him. He was clearly astonished and concerned to see Marianne leave the room in such a way. "Is your sister ill?" he asked anxiously. Eleanor answered unwillingly that she was, and talked of headaches and overtiredness and anything that could reasonably explain her sister's behaviour. Their conversation continued on more impersonal subjects, until Mrs. Jennings entered the room with all her usual noisy cheerfulness. "Oh, Colonel," said she, "I am so glad to see you, and you see, I have brought 2 young ladies with me. Your friend Miss Marianne is here too. You will not be sorry to hear that. I don't know what you and Mr. Willoughby will do about her, between you. But, Colonel, where have you been since we saw you at Barton Park? Come, let's have no secrets among friends." He replied politely, but gave no real answer, and did not stay long. The ladies all agreed to go to bed early. The next morning Marianne looked happy again. Yesterday's disappointment seemed forgotten in the cheerful expectation of what was to happen that day. They spent the morning shopping in a fashionable part of London with Mrs. Palmer. During this time, Marianne was restless and inattentive, always looking out at the street, and wildly impatient to be at home again. As soon as they returned, she ran in eagerly. "Has no letter been left for me?" she asked the servant. "No, miss," he replied. "Are you quite sure? No card, or letter, or note?" "How very strange," she said in a low, disappointed voice. Strange indeed, Eleanor thought worriedly. If Willoughby is in town, why does he not come or write? Oh, my dear mother, you must be wrong to permit an engagement between a daughter so young and a man so little known to continue in such a doubtful and mysterious manner. For the rest of the day, Marianne seemed agitated, unable to concentrate on anything. When they met at breakfast the next morning, Mrs. Jennings said, "If this sunny weather goes on much longer, Sir John will not want to leave Barton to come to London. It's a sad thing for a sportsman to lose a day's shooting." "That is true," cried Marianne, suddenly cheerful. "I had not thought of that. This fine weather will keep many sportsmen in the country, but now it is January, it cannot last. I expect we shall have frost soon, and then they will all come to town. Why, it may even freeze tonight." During the next few days, Eleanor was both amused and saddened to see Marianne's new-found interest in the weather. "The wind has changed, has it not, Eleanor? I feel sure it is colder than this morning. I think we shall have a frost tonight." Mrs. Jennings was always very kind to her two young guests. Her domestic arrangements were generous, and her friends were pleasant, if a little dull. Colonel Brandon visited them almost every day. He came to look at Marianne and talk to Eleanor, who saw with concern his continued affection for her sister. About a week after their arrival, they discovered Willoughby's card on the table when they returned from their morning's drive. "Good heavens!" cried Marianne. "He has been here while we were out." From this moment her mind was never quiet. The expectation of seeing him every hour of the day made her unfit for anything. She insisted on being left at home the next morning when the others went out. When a note was delivered the next day, she stepped quickly forward to take it. "For me!" she cried. But it was for Mrs. Jennings, and she was again disappointed. "You are expecting a letter, then?" said Eleanor, unable to keep silent any longer. "Yes, a little, not much." There was a short pause. "You have no confidence in me, Marianne?" "Eleanor, how can you say that? You have confidence in no one." "Me?" replied Eleanor in some confusion. "Indeed, Marianne, I have nothing to tell." "Nor I," answered Marianne firmly. "So our situations are alike. Neither of us has anything to tell, you because you communicate nothing, and I because I hide nothing." And Eleanor, aware that she had promised not to tell Lucy Steele's secret, felt she could not demand greater openness from Marianne than she was herself ready to offer. The next evening was spent at a dance at Lady Middleton's London home. Once Marianne realised Willoughby was not present, she took no interest in any of the guests, and complained that she found dancing too tiring. But worse was yet to come. On their return, Mrs. Jennings told them that Willoughby had been invited, and expressed her surprise that he had not appeared. Marianne looked extremely hurt, and Eleanor decided to write to their mother, asking her to find out the truth from Marianne. Eleanor had only just finished her letter the next morning when Colonel Brandon arrived. Marianne, who hated visitors of any kind except one, left the room before he entered it, and Eleanor found herself alone with him. He sat for a time without saying a word, and then asked her, in an agitated manner, whether he should congratulate her on gaining a brother-in-law. Eleanor was not prepared for such a question, and asked him what he meant. He tried to smile as he continued, Your sister's engagement to Mr. Willoughby is very generally known. Her own family do not know it, Eleanor answered. Surprised, he said, I am so sorry. I fear you may think me impolite. I had not supposed any secrecy was intended, as they openly correspond. Just now, when the servant let me in, I saw an envelope in his hand with Mr. Willoughby's address on it in your sister's writing. I came to inquire, but I am afraid I know the answer. Is it impossible for me to... But I would have no chance of succeeding. Tell me, I beg you, that it is all arranged. Then I shall have no choice but to hide my feelings. I am not astonished to hear of their correspondence, replied Eleanor, choosing her words carefully, and I am well aware of the affection they have for each other, although they have not yet informed us of the details of their engagement. He listened silently. I wish your sister all imaginable happiness, and I hope that Willoughby will try to deserve her, he said in a voice full of feeling, and then rose to leave. In the next few days, Willoughby neither came nor wrote. Marianne was losing hope, becoming depressed, and careless of her appearance. She took no pleasure in dressing for a party she and Eleanor were to attend with Lady Middleton. When they arrived in the hot, crowded room, she sank into a chair, not even looking at the other guests. Eleanor, however, saw Willoughby standing nearby, in conversation with a very elegant young lady. She turned to Marianne, who noticed him at that moment. Her whole face shone with sudden delight, and she would have run to him at once if her sister had not caught hold of her. "Good heavens!" Marianne cried. "He is there! Oh, why does he not look at me? Why cannot I speak to him?" "I beg you, be calm," said Eleanor. "Try to hide your feelings." But this was impossible for Marianne. She sat there, her anxiety and impatience written clearly on her face. At last, Willoughby turned round and looked at them both. Marianne jumped up and held out her hand affectionately to him. He came closer and spoke to Eleanor rather than her sister, asking in a hurried manner after Mrs. Dashwood. Marianne blushed deeply and cried, "What is the meaning of this, Willoughby? Will you not shake hands with me?" He could not avoid it then, but he held her hand only for a moment. "I did myself the honour of calling on you last week, when you were unfortunately not at home." "But have you not received my letters?" cried Marianne in the wildest anxiety. "There must be some terrible mistake. Tell me, Willoughby, I beg you, what is the matter?" He looked ashamed, but on catching the eye of the young lady with whom he had been talking, his expression seemed to harden. "Yes," he said, "I had the pleasure of receiving information of your arrival in town, which you were so good as to send me," and turned away to join his friend. Marianne, looking horribly white, was unable to stand, and Eleanor helped her to a chair. Soon Willoughby was seen to leave the party, and as Marianne was clearly unwell, Eleanor asked Lady Middleton to take them home. Nothing was said between the sisters, as Marianne was suffering too much to speak. Eleanor now realised that for Willoughby the attachment was over, and she felt extreme distaste for his manner of ending it. Neither sister slept much that night, and it was still dark when Eleanor was woken by the sound of agitated sobbing. She saw Marianne, only half-dressed, writing as fast as a constant flow of tears would permit her. "Marianne, may I ask—" said Eleanor gently. "No, Eleanor. Ask nothing. You will soon know all." This was said with a sort of desperate calmness, which lasted only as long as she spoke. It seemed probable that she was writing for the last time to Willoughby. The letter was given to a servant, to be delivered by hand, and the sisters went down to breakfast. Soon afterwards a letter arrived from Marianne, who went deathly pale and instantly ran out of the room. Mrs. Jennings laughed comfortably. "Is that a love letter from Willoughby? Well, well, I never saw a young woman so passionately in love in my life. I hope he won't keep her waiting much longer." Eager to know what Willoughby had written, Eleanor hurried to their room. Marianne was lying on her bed, sobbing violently. Eleanor took her sister's hand, kissed her affectionately several times, and burst into tears herself. Marianne, although unable to speak, seemed to feel her sister's loving sympathy, and silently gave her Willoughby's letter to read. "My dear Madam, I have just had the honour of receiving your letter, for which I thank you. I am concerned to find there was anything in my behaviour last night that you did not approve of, and I beg your forgiveness. I shall always remember my former visits to your family with the most grateful pleasure, but I hope I have never given anyone reason to think that I felt more for you than I ever expressed. You will accept that I could never have meant more when you understand that my affections have long been engaged, and it will not be many weeks before the lady and I are married. I obey your orders to return your letters and the lock of hair which you so kindly offered me. Your obedient servant, John Willoughby." Eleanor was horrified. She had expected a confession, explanations and reasons, but not expressed in a manner so far from every honourable and gentlemanly feeling. How could Willoughby have written a letter so cruel, so hurtful? It was a relief to her that Marianne had escaped any connection with such a man. She turned to her sister, who now felt able to speak. "Poor Eleanor, how unhappy I make you. I only wish there were anything I could do which might be of comfort to you." "Oh, Eleanor, I am so miserable," said Marianne, before her voice was completely lost in passionate and bitter sobbing. "Calm yourself, dear Marianne. Think of how much more you would have suffered if the discovery of his real character had come at the end of your engagement." "Engagement?" cried Marianne. "There has been no engagement. He has not made or broken any promise to me." "But he told you that he loved you?" "Yes. No, never absolutely. He never said it in so many words, but every day I read it in his eyes. I felt myself as firmly engaged as if lawyers had written the agreement for us." Unfortunately, he did not feel the same. "He did, Eleanor. For weeks and weeks he did. This lock of hair which he says I offered him, he begged and begged me for it on his knees. And now, oh! Eleanor was quite alarmed for her sister's health, as the violence of her sobbing grew, but she managed to persuade her to take some medicine to calm her restless pain of mind and body. Kind Mrs. Jennings showed real concern when she visited the patient. She had heard that Marianne's rival was a Miss Grey, a young woman with £50,000 a year, and that Willoughby had seriously overspent on his carriages and horses and needed money urgently. Mrs. Jennings had no words hard enough to describe his behaviour. She was sincerely sorry she had joked so often about Marianne's attachment, but, with the return of her natural cheerfulness, hoped that it would all be for the best, because now Marianne could marry Colonel Brandon after all.